Okay, Andrew, I'm ready to go. So sorry for holding you up.
Not at all, John. So I'll just continue my introduction. We have with us Dr. John Goodlad, a man of many talents, as well as being an academic and a writer. He's worked in the Shetland seafood industries for many years, and he's also famous for standing for Parliament for the Orkney and Shetland movement in 1987. And he's now the Norwegian Honorary Consul for Shetland. And today he's going to talk about a very interesting period in Shetland history, and about the cod hunters and the economic, social and cultural links between Shetland, Faroe and Iceland in the 19th century. Now, I'll just find this ball, John, and bring it down. Just about there.
Classic lorry.
Yep.
Okay.
So you should see your share now in white. Share content. There we go.
Can you see?
Certainly can.
Good. Okay. Well, Andrew, thank you very much for that kind introduction. A man of many talents who can't work his computer, I think, is the most appropriate thing for you to say. I'm so sorry for holding you all up. I'll try and skip through this a little bit faster than I was going to, so we can get you back on schedule. Delighted to have been asked to do the keynote address at this conference, and I'm delighted to see the title of this conference, Island Histories and Her Stories, Histories, a long overdue perspective on history in any place, but particularly in Shetland. I've a bit of a problem with my subject in terms of that focus of the conference. If I was doing my keynote about the herring fishing in Shetland, I could devote at least half of my time to talk about the gutters, who got it and packed all the salt herring. I could talk about the women who mended the drift nets. One of my earliest recollections as a small boy is sitting with my mother and father, both mending drift nets during the winter, ready for next season's herring fishing. Likewise, the haddock line fishery, all the baiting of the lines was done by women, a crucial role because a poorly baited hook, of course, never caught a fish. But the cod fishery that I'm going to talk about seems to have been an exclusively male preserve. All the fishers were men, all the processing of the salt fish on the beaches were undertaken by boys. And when researching my book, and this is the cover title of my book, The Cod Hunters, when I was looking at all the archive work, I was very much aware that the 19th century Fishery Board record, the customs records, these were records written by men from a man's perspective. And you would really think, reading through these 19th century records, that there were no women nor children that existed in 19th century Shetland. So what little I was able to find out and add into my book very much came from oral history as opposed to the official record. Anyhow, the cod hunters, I'm going to take one or two aspects of my book which I think fit into the theme of your conference and, as Andrew said, deal with the really interesting links between Shetland and the rest of the North Atlantic archipelago. What I'm hoping to do is quickly run through the 100-year fishery. I'm then going to talk a bit about how the fishery went from Shetland to Faroe. I'm thirdly going to look at the linguistic connections between Shetland and Faroe in the 19th century. I'm then going to look at a really interesting part of this fishery, which was the incredible smuggling activity which took place between Faroe and Shetland, brandy and tobacco smuggled from Faroe to Shetland. And then finally, I'm going to look at what I call the old grey widowmaker, how the sea was the source of much anxiety, much distress and much tragedy. So the fishery began in 1818 and lasted until 1908, almost 100 years. And it was fishing for cod. And it started on the so-called home grounds. These are the grounds to the southwest of Thule, marked on this map, but very quickly extended as a distant water fishery to the Faroe Bank and off northwest Faroe, to Rockall and to Iceland, but not all Iceland, specifically the northeast coast of Iceland, and then also, incredibly, to Greenland for a few years. The fishery was undertaken by smacks. These were two-masted schooners, about 80 of these in Shetland at the peak of the fishery. This is one, the William Martin, a very famous smack, one of the last ones that sailed from Scalloway, owned and operated and crewed from Scalloway. The fishing method was incredibly simple. Every crew member, and there were about 12 or 14 or even 16 in these boats, had a single line, and on that line were two hooks baited over the side. So a smack fishing would have looked like this. Lines being fished at different depths, targeting cod. As soon as there was one or two cod on board, you hauled it on board, and this would have been a scene from a cod smack. All of these Shetlanders, many of them young, many of the crews were incredibly young, teenagers, early 20s. Skipper might have been 28, 30 years old, catching cod, big fish on board. When the cod was taken on board, it was gutted, it was headed, it was split, and then it was put into the hold in salt. So these vessels stayed at sea for 12 or 14 weeks, splitting, salting cod on board. And when they came back, the cod, split and salted, was then laid out on beaches to dry. And these were the so-called beach boys, the young boys, 10 to 14 years old, who did a few years on the beaches, where they would lay these cod out to dry. At the first sign of rain, the cod was put into so-called steeples, piled up into these piles, covered with tarpaulins, and every night they had to be put into these, piled up into these steeples and covered with tarpaulins. After about 6 weeks, the salt cod was dry. It was as dry and hard, it was like a piece of wood. And then, of course, it was preserved for eating. And we forget in the 19th century, before freezers and before modern food techniques, the only way you could eat protein anywhere in the world, and certainly in Europe, was by salting and drying it. So this was then exported all over, but particularly to Spain. It dominated the economy of the North Atlantic. Not only was this happening in Shetland with cod, also with ling from the half open boats. It was happening in Faroe, happening in Iceland. Most people worked at this trade. It dominated the economy. And so much so that without the slightest trace of irony, Halldór Laxness, the Nobel Prize winner, the famous author from Iceland, said in his wonderful novel, Salkavalda, in 1931, when all is said and done, life is first and foremost about salt fish. He was talking about a little Icelandic fishing community, which was the setting for his novel, Salkavalda. But when I saw that phrase, and it wasn't ironic, he wasn't being funny, everything, the economy, the society, the culture, focused around saltfish. And I then looked at what was happening in Shetland and in other places in the 19th century. And it was, of course, it rang very, very true. The fish, once it was salted on the beaches, was exported largely to Spain, to Bilbao in the Basque region, and Santander. And here, the Shetland cured cod was used to make bacalao. I'm sure many of you have tasted that wonderful Spanish and Basque cuisine. About 300 recipes based on salt-dried cod, bacalao. And this was the main market for the product. So this fishery reached its peak in about 1870 with about 60 or 80 of these smacks catching 11,000 tons of cod in most years, dominated the Shetland economy. And then in the 1880s, Shetlanders began to fish for herring. They could earn more money as herring fishermen, and the smack owners were finding it very difficult to get crews for the smacks. But they were making good money selling their salt cod to Spain, so they began to crew the Shetland smacks with Faroese fishermen. So you would have perhaps a Shetland skipper, Shetland mate, one or two Shetland crews, but the rest of the crew would be Faroese, picked up in the Faroe Islands and then on board for the entire cod fishing season. Here's one of my favourite photographs of Faroes, Sorfagsfjordur and Tindholm. This was a fjord which was used by the Shetland smacks on a weekly basis. They came in here to get provisions, to get fresh water, and to get bait for fishing and picking up young Faroese fishermen. Over time, hundreds of Faroese fishermen learned the trade on board Shetland smacks, and as the cod fishery began to decline in Shetland, many of the smacks were sold to the Faroese, who were beginning to develop their own cod fishery. In many ways, Shetland passed on its secrets of catching, salting, curing cod to the Faroese. As Shetland left cod for herring, so did the Faroese take on the cod fishing industry. For any of you who've spent any time at sea or have fished, you'll know that there's a very special bond that develops between people who sail together and fish together. A very deep and profound relationship builds up, as it did between the two communities of Shetland and Faroe. And the Faroese very much believe that their future success in fishing all stemmed from the Shetlanders learning them the trade. And I'm going to share with you an interesting quote. In 1928, Johannes Patterson, one of the founders of the original Faroese Home Rule movement, visited Shetland, and he spoke in the Lerwick Town Hall about this, how Shetland had passed on its trade secrets to the Faroese. It's a little bit flowery language, but you know, this was 1928. And I'll just quote, it says, "Once again, Shetlanders and Faroese joined hands some 60 or 70 years ago, when our common heritage, the highway of our common Viking ancestors, the deep rolling blue oceans that brings us our greatest material riches, takes with ruthless hand our finest manhood, brought your fishing fleets to our shores, and Shetlanders first taught us deep sea fishing in decked vessels." These young Faroese crews who sailed on board these Shetland smacks would have had very little English, if any. And of course, the Shetlanders didn't speak Faroese, but they did speak Shetlandic, and they did speak the Shetland dialect, which is still spoken today, but in the 19th century it would have been a much stronger dialect with a much greater vocabulary and a perhaps more distinct grammar than we have today. So much so that there was a level of mutual understanding. And just those of you who have travelled to Faroe and know Faroe and Shetland will be aware of this, but just as an example, when I first went to the Faroe Islands, I was struck by how much I felt at home, for many reasons. You know, the boats, the fishing, but also the language. And here's just a few very simple examples. And these are just ones that I was immediately taken with when I arrived in Faroe for the first time. The Shetland word for a porpoise is a nisik. In Faroese, it's nisa. The Shetland word for a black guillemot is a taisti. And in the Faroese language, it's also taisti, although spelt slightly differently. And of course, shalder, the famous oyster catcher, is known as chalder in Faroese. And there's hundreds of examples. And then, of course, place names. If you look at a map of Faroe and a map of Shetland, it's all the same names, spelt slightly differently. And here's a few: whiteness, whiteness, sand, Thule, Fugloi, and Vovaga. I've heard Shetlanders looking at a map of Faroe and saying, these are all Shetland names. And I've also had Faroese people looking at the map of Shetland and saying, but these are all Faroese names on the Shetland map. So an incredibly close linguistic connection. And I want now to read a little bit from my book about Dr. Jakobsen. Many of you will be aware that Dr. Jakobsen was a famous Faroese linguist who was part of the radical movement in the late 19th century, which tried to establish Faroese as the language of Faroe rather than Danish, which was taking over. And Jakobsen first visited Shetland to look at what had happened to Shetland Norn. So I'll read a little bit from my book about Dr. Jakobsen and Shetland. Jakobsen decided to undertake a study of what had happened to Shetland Norn under the pervading influence of Scots and English. Shetland was to be used as a warning signal to the Faroese about what would happen if they allowed their language to die, as the Shetlanders had done with theirs. As he travelled through Shetland, the place, its people, and the remnants of Shetland Norn increasingly fascinated him. He became so passionate about Shetland Norn that he made this his life's work, travelling the length and breadth of Shetland over a 2-year period, speaking to hundreds of crofters and fishermen. He made many long-lasting friendships. He believed that the Old Norse language of Shetland is the language of Faroe, and he was saddened to see how diluted it had become. Like many academics, his subject dominated his life. He possibly became rather obsessed. When asked to give a lecture in Lerwick about Shetland Norn, he reckoned it would take at least 6 hours to say everything he wanted to say on the subject. The organisers asked one of his Lerwick friends to persuade him to make the lecture shorter. It's not known what the final result was. 2 hours, perhaps? These were the days before minimum attention span and the soundbite. He eventually recorded some 10,000 Old Norse words, place names and phrases still used by Shetlanders at the end of the 19th century. His work earned him a PhD and was subsequently published as a 2-volume dictionary of the Northern language in Shetland. He also published 2 books, one on the Shetland dialect and the other about Shetland place names. This work provides a rigorous snapshot of a dying language and a fascinating glimpse into how Shetlanders used to converse with each other. And while Jakobsen was recording these last traces of Shetland Norn, the Shetland cod fishermen and the Faroese people they met were able to at least partially understand each other on a very practical and everyday manner. The Shetlanders had fished around Faroe for almost 60 years, a very long time that spanned several generations. Although Shetlandic was no longer Shetland Norn, the speech of the cod fishermen was infused with an enormous number of Norn words, phrases and idioms, particularly relating to boats, the weather and the sea. It is therefore not surprising that Shetland cod fishermen, when speaking Shetlandic, were able to converse to some extent with the Faroese. Such linguistic experiments would have been commonplace whenever the Shetlanders were ashore in Faroe and wherever there was Faroese crew on board the Shetland smacks. I want now to move on to smuggling. This is a brandy pig. It's an earthenware jar that was commonly used throughout Europe for storing many liquids, but was used very much for storing brandy and other alcohol. There's one from the Shetland Museum. I'd heard about, when I was growing up, I'd heard about the Faroese, I'd heard about the cod fishermen coming back from Faroe on board the smacks, and they always took back some brandy and tobacco. There was no excise duty in the Faroe Islands at this time. There was in Shetland, so it made Faroe was a little bit like a huge duty-free store. So it made sense to take back duty-free alcohol and tobacco. And I knew about this, and I'd always assumed it was kind of for own use. There were lots of stories and folklore about when the smacks came back, they hid the brandy pigs and the other contraband before they came into Scalloway, when the customs came on board. And and we were in Faroe in and there's a lovely pub there, Shetland, when fishing around Faroe. Often who said,
"Hello, John. You're having broadband problems a little bit there. Could you switch off your camera just to increase the bandwidth for your screen, for your slides?"
Okay, how do I?
If you look at the bottom of the screen, the buttons there, that's the one.
Can't see it.
You've got mute, start video, share. So if you just click on start video, that you should be able to stop your video there.
Okay. Yeah. I'm not right. Oh yes, but mute. Right, that's my video off.
And you're coming in loud and clear.
So will I? Where do you want me to go back to?
Just the Faroe. Just the slide after the brandy pig.
Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you.
Okay, right. I'll.
The nice picture of the lady standing outside the Faroese house at Faroe.
I was.
Hello, John. That's the slide.
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Can hear you now. I don't know if you were speaking just a little bit before, but we didn't hear you. But we can hear you now.
Okay, I'm not sure what's happening. Okay, can you still hear me?
Yes, I can hear your dulcet tones.
Okay, I'm so sorry. So yeah, we were sitting in the bar having a beer, ready to leave. Anna Kirsten had seen the boat, saw we were from Shetland, and came across and said that her great grandfather had run this store, and he used to do a lot of business with the Shetland cod fishermen. So we got talking about the smuggling, and I said I was really interested because, of course, there are no archive records in Shetland at all about smuggling because it was all illegal. The only records you can find are the occasional one where a cod fisherman was sent to prison because the customs had discovered brandy or tobacco on board the boat. So I asked if she had any records, if the company had any records of the level of trade between the Faroese and merchant house and the Shetland cod fishermen. And she said, absolutely, there were lots of records showing which fishermen bought what on what date. And so that was fascinating. I said, were these ledgers in the archives in Tórshavn or maybe in Copenhagen? She said, no, they were just next door. And we went in just to where we were sitting in the pub in a little room, which had obviously been the old office for the merchant store. And there on tables were these old dusty ledgers from the 1860s and 1870s. And looking through those ledgers, was the incredible level of detail. Two things shocked me. First of all, the scale of purchases. For an average season, a cod fisherman at this time would have earned about £18 for his year. Some of the fishermen were buying brandy to the tune of 21 to 23 and even more pounds. Imagine buying something that was illegal and spending more than your annual salary on that. This was clearly not for personal consumption. This was a huge trade in selling on brandy and tobacco and contraband when you got back to Shetland and making a markup. The second thing which shocked me was that for every purchase that was undertaken, the Faroese merchant gave a year's credit. So if you bought your brandy in 1864, you only paid for it in 1865, by which time you'd have sold it back home in Shetland at a tidy profit. It also showed the incredible level of trust that built up between the Shetland cod fishermen and these Faroese merchants. So the level of smuggling was such that this was part of the cod story that was unknown and really untold. Huge quantities coming back and building up really quite a black market for the sale of alcohol and tobacco during the late 19th century. My final surprise going through all of these records, they were in Danish, but they were very clearly laid out, and you could see the names of the fishermen, the date, which boat, and when they were paid. Another thing that surprised me, I found one of my own ancestors, William Goodlad. He was a regular buyer of brandy, and maybe that's why I felt so much at home in Suðuroy. There's something called genetic memory. When you go to a place that your ancestors have been, some people argue there's something that comes through in your genes and in your DNA. However, fanciful or not that may be, it was a wonderful discovery, and I write quite a bit about this aspect of the link between Faroe and Shetland in my book. So moving on to the final part of my lecture, the old grey widowmaker. Rudyard Kipling is not a terribly politically correct poet these days, but I've always found his poem, The Old Grey Widowmaker, is very apt. And there's the famous stanza, and this is the poem called The Harp Song of the Dane Woman. What is a woman that you forsake her, and the hearth fire and the homemaker, to go with the old grey widowmaker? And this is a poem about a Viking, a Dane, leaving his wife, leaving his farm, and going to sea. And I think that expression, the old grey widowmaker, is so apt. In wintertime, the sea is never blue. It's dismally grey. It's often nearly black. And of course, it was, and was for a long time, and still is, a widowmaker. Many people were and are still lost at sea. Bad weather, stormy conditions are part of life when you fish the North Atlantic. Here's a photograph of one of the Shetland smacks that was bought to Faroe. And this was, by the time photography was coming common, this was taken probably about the 1920s. Really interesting photograph. You can see the sea is coming in over the rail of the boat, very rough day. But the most fascinating thing about this picture is the fisherman. He's standing there one hand in his pocket, obviously completely relaxed. He doesn't even have his oilskins on. He just has his gansey, his jumper and his trousers. He hasn't even got his all-weather gear on. So clearly, this wasn't a particularly bad day. There's a Faroese artist called Kari Skallagard who paints from this period, and here's a wonderful painting of the Johanna from Vaga. She's one of the Faroese smacks that sometimes comes into Lerwick, comes into Scalloway, and here she is with her sails well reefed down, the fishermen on board with their oilskins battling through a severe storm. When researching my book, I became fascinated by Faroese art, and in particular the work of Samuel Jonsson, who was known as Mykonos. He was born on the small island of Mykonos. Born in 1906, he's probably the most famous of all the many very good Faroese artists. He remained very close to his home island, and it was a constant source of inspiration to him as an artist. Living on this small island where many men were lost at sea, many boats were lost at sea over a long period of time, had a very profound effect on his work. And the period, although he did all kinds of painting, there's a very bleak part of his work that deals with loss at sea, the harsh realities of living in Faroe when people were being lost at sea. He once said that some village in Faroe was always mourning the loss of a cod fisherman at some time. And many of his paintings paint not so much the boats at sea as this artist has painted, but the people who were left behind. And it's the paintings of the women and children that were left behind that defined so much of his art. And the Faroese Prime Minister, Johannes Eskegard, a few years ago, spoke about Mykonos, and he said in a tribute, he paints the women with their children on the desolate shore, watching the ships leave for the Icelandic fishing grounds. He paints those who anxiously wait for their loved ones to return, and he describes their dread, despair, and sense of loss at the news of a death. He portrays their sorrow, but also their hope and faith. Two of my favourite paintings, which are undertaken by, which were done by Mykonos, were both called, confusingly, Ships Departing. One is a little bit cheery. It's the one I used for the front cover of my book, and it's this woman with a long blue dress looking out to sea, seeing a boat coming back in. There's a sense of anticipation. Maybe it's her father, maybe it's her brother, maybe it's her husband, maybe her boyfriend coming back from the fishing grounds. The second one is much bleaker. The sea is black, and here is a woman with her two children as the boats leave to go to the fishing grounds. The woman and her daughter won't look. They're turning their back on the boats as they go to sea. The son steals a look over his mother's shoulder. You wonder if he's dreading the day, maybe in a couple of years' time, that he'll be joining his father on one of these boats, or he's maybe looking forward to it. But clearly the sense of dread when these boats come back in 12 weeks' time, in 10 weeks' time, will everybody still be alive on board, or even will the boat herself come back? So I love this art, and I want finally to read another small bit from my book regarding the loss of a Shetland smack. It was early March of 1876, and the crew of the John Walker was getting ready for their first trip of the year. Before leaving, the crew had to sign the customary agreement with the smack owners. The skipper always signed first. His name was John Hunter from Whiteness. Although only 35 years old, he had been skipper with the Shetland Fishing Company since the company's formation. He had previously sailed in command of 2 of the other smacks belonging to the company and had now been promoted to captain one of their finest vessels. Built in Aberdeen in 1873, the John Walker was a brand new smack. Looking forward to his first trip, John Hunter reflected that this was a good smack to be skipper of. Almost brand new, her earning potential was high. He could not wait to get started. Fishing was poor when they arrived in Faroe. After a couple of weeks, John Hunter was getting impatient. There's nothing worse for a keen fisherman than no fish. The weather was also unsettled, and they often had to lie in the shelter of Faroe. On one occasion, they were ashore in Tórshavn, and he wrote a letter to his wife, Mary Abernethy, saying he was thinking of trying rockall if the Faroe fishing did not improve shortly. The letter was posted on 23rd March. When the weather eased, the John Walker went back to the Faroe bank, and after a few days of poor fishing, was one of several smacks that once more had to take shelter. All of those smacks rode out the storm that night together. When morning came, the John Walker was nowhere to be seen. A combination of mist and rain meant that visibility was poor, so it was thought she was probably just out of sight. But there was no sign of her over the next few days, and as the Shetland smacks returned to fish the Faroe bank, it was assumed that John Hunter had finally got so fed up that he was away to try his luck fishing at rockall. When the smacks began to return home from their first trips at the end of April, they were surprised that John Walker was not already back in Scalloway. As the first days of May turned into weeks, concern began to grow. Despite this, some fishermen remained confident that she had gone to rockall and would be coming back any day soon with a good catch. But these hopes were dashed when the Sapphire returned from rockall at the end of May, and the skipper confirmed he had not seen or heard of the John Walker amongst the 17 smacks fishing there. With this news, worry spread throughout the community, and some began to fear the worst. Mary remained convinced that her husband had gone to rockall. With each passing day, hope faded, but she kept rereading the letter he had sent from Faroe, and she convinced herself they had gone to rockall and would shortly be returning. Although she had 3 small daughters to look after, she began walking from her croft at Kirkhouse in Whiteness to the beach curing area at Hirpa, where she would get an unimpeded view of the sea. Knowing that the John Walker was most likely to land its catch at Hirpa, she believed she would see the smack sailing back soon. Her hope possibly became an obsession as her anxiety increased. Some days she would walk to Hirpa 3 times, even though the round trip took about an hour. One particularly beautiful Saturday morning, as she set out early, she saw a smack under full sail in the distance. This was not an unusual sight, as smacks were coming and going all the time in the Vos north of Scalloway. She nevertheless quickened her pace. As she reached the crest of the hill above Hirpa, the smack was in clear sight. There was no mistaking her. It was definitely the John Walker. With her heart pounding, she broke into a run, gathering her long blue skirt as she ran down the brae to the beach. By the time she reached the cod stores, the smack was preparing to tie up at the pier. Stopping to catch her breath, her sense of elation began to falter. She read the name board on the smack. It was the Robert Kirkwood, the sister ship to the John Walker. Both built by the same yard in Aberdeen, they were identical. As a consequence of this cruel state of mistaken identity, Mary Abernethy lost her voice for weeks afterwards. Whenever I recall this story of Mary Abernethy, the image of Mykonos's painting comes to mind. What happened to Mary Abernethy? It was probably post-traumatic stress. She eventually recovered her voice. There was no counselling, no medication. She suddenly had to run a croft, and raise a family of 3 daughters by herself without a source of income. While her husband had been lost at sea in who knows what dreadful circumstances, that at least was the end for him. Mary and hundreds of Shetland and Faroese women like her had to bear the emotional and financial consequences of these losses for the rest of their lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, John, for that very thoughtful talk, which has got the conference off to a tremendous start. And some beautiful images there of Michenes's paintings as well, which really fire the imagination. There have been some diverse questions posted up. So if you could maybe stop sharing your screen and turn your camera on again, that would be great. Yes, okay. Well, as I say, there's some diverse questions. So there was an interesting one about shoes. Just this wee second here. Fiona Sanderson was wondering about the kind of shoes that the fishermen might have been wearing in the 1920s shot. She's heard about some shoes being made of fish skin, but wondered if you knew anything about what they would have been wearing.
Yeah, I've never heard that about fish skin. I mean, I would imagine that fish skin dried, whatever you're wearing on board a boat, the one thing is for certain it's going to get wet, either with sea spray or with rain or whatever. So I wouldn't have thought that would have been worn on board boats. It would have been leather, and leather which the fishermen then coated with oil to try and make it waterproof. Generally, when fishing and working, they would have had quite long, I was going to say it weren't rubber boots, but you know what I mean, long Wellingtons that stretched quite far up over the calves to try and keep themselves dry, because when fishing, any kind of fishing, it's just wet everywhere. Yeah,
not a pleasant experience. And well, you also your comment on genetic memory has fired up someone's imagination as well. So Myrit has asked, I find the concept of genetic memory very interesting, and has there been any research done on this in the context of the Northern Isles?
I don't know. This was part of a really interesting discussion which I had with somebody. I first travelled to Faroe when I was a university student. I've been there about 20 times, and I'm sure all of you have had this experience of going to somewhere for the first time. And it's always interesting, it's always fascinating, but occasionally you go to a place and it feels strangely familiar. And that was my impression with the Faroe Islands. And I used to just think it's because it's an island group, it's got the same kind of weather as Shetland, there are the linguistic similarities, and there's lots of fishing. But I was talking to somebody who said that, John, that might be genetic memory, and they explained what this was. So I'm writing another book at the moment, and I explore this idea of genetic memory a little bit more in my own context, linking it to my ancestor and I had many ancestors who fished on board these boats and were trading with the Faroese. So it's a fascinating area, and there has been some research on this. It's completely inconclusive. Some people say it's fanciful nonsense. Other people say there's definitely something in this. I don't know whether there's been any specific research on this in terms of the Northern Isles. I certainly haven't come across any, but I don't know.
Thank you very much. Look forward to your next book. And also, well, perhaps unsurprisingly, smuggling has generated a question as well. And it's Fiona who wonders, is there any way of telling how it was traded on once it got to Shetland?
Yes, again, nothing really at all from the official record, but in terms of folklore, there's a little bit. I think the scale of it was always a little bit hidden until I discovered this records. But I think every fisherman who took back brandy and tobacco had his customers, and coming back from a trip, they would spend several days going round, and they would never come in a house and do the transaction. What they'd do, they'd always go into the barn and leave it in a particular place, or go into a peat stack, or somewhere in a field, and then they would come in and they would the famous expression which they would come in and say, "I've left your gear in the usual place," and money would be changed hands. So it was very, and it had to be that it had to be quite clandestine, because the customs and excise got really exercised about the scale of this activity, and they put a lot of effort in the 1880s and 1890s to try and stamp it out. So if somebody was caught, which was rare, they had to pay either large fines or were sent to prison for several months. So there are an official record of several cod fishermen spending 2 or 3 months hard labour in Lerwick, but it never deterred them. And the interesting thing socially and culturally was that there was no sense of shame and no sense that somehow they were criminals. It was just another risk in a very risky job. The community consensus was very much on the side of most people were either smuggling it or buying it from the smugglers, and the excise men were complaining that they could get no local intel. Nobody would tell them what was happening. So, fascinating piece of social history.
Absolutely. I think as far as the fishermen were concerned, maybe two months of hard labour would be a bit of a holiday compared to their normal activities.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, genetic memory, as there's a number of comments about this. There's one from Laurie, who says, do you think that genetic memory has something to do with islandness, that instantaneous recognition that so many have when they visit an island? So I don't know if you want to comment on that.
It might be more pronounced, but I suppose the two things could be quite different. Islandness, you could feel a similarity to another island group just because it's another small island group. So, for example, I've been lucky enough to go to the Azores, and that's a small island group in the middle of the Atlantic. I felt a great sense of islandness, but it didn't feel as if I was at home there. But whereas genetic memory was very powerful when I arrived in Faroe, I thought there's something funny here. That you know, it wasn't that I knew to take a third turn on the right. It wasn't anything like that. But it was a feeling. This all feels very familiar, and I couldn't explain it. So it's. I look forward to reading more research by psychologists or geneticists or whoever does the kind of research in this in the future.
Excellent. We've got time just for one last question here from Dave, who's one of my students who does island studies. And he says, you've made a compelling case for shared culture of Shetland and Faroes through cod and language. Does Faroese autonomy still offer a model for Shetland's future? Well, there you go. A question for your other hat.
That's a very simple question for me to answer in one word. Well, in 2 words, absolutely yes.
Excellent. Well, I think we have a few more minutes, but I think we'll perhaps draw that to an end so that we have time for checking out that the next session is going to work properly. So I'd just like to thank you very much indeed, John, for a really, a multifaceted talk. So many different things to take away from it and to think about, and beautifully illustrated as well. And thanks very much for sticking with it when the whatever the problem was at the beginning. So it works extremely well. And
right, okay, well it's 10 o'clock now, so I am very happy to kick off the first session following our fascinating keynote speak there. And this session is, of course, really fully in theme with the whole conference, and it's called Women from the Northern Isles. we have 3 speakers in this session, and they are all going to present their talks in turn, and you are very welcome to post your questions in the chat as they're speaking, if you're thinking of questions while you're listening to their presentations. We will keep an eye on the chat, and once all 3 speakers have presented, then I will read out the questions, and all the different speakers will get a chance to answer their questions. So, feel free, keep the questions flowing, and we'll try to answer as many as possible. We'll try to make sure that we can spread them around as well, so that all speakers get a chance to answer questions. So we'll see how many questions we have time for. But we have a good bit. I have 15 minutes after the presentation, so I'll finish. So that should be fine. Can I also ask everybody who's not speaking to switch off the microphone, so that we don't get any interference while the speakers are presenting. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker for this session, and we are delighted that Rose Pipes has put in an abstract, and she, Rose, is the co-editor of the new Biographical Dictionary of Scottish Women. She's going to be talking about this theme today. She's also a former commissioning editor for Oliver Boyd Publishers in Edinburgh, and she has published a number of books, for example, on local history, which of course is very topical for today as well. So I'm giving the word to you now, Rose, to talk about women from the Northern Isles in the new Biographical Dictionary of Scottish Women. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, my role as one of the editors, and you can see the list on the screen there, of the new Biographical Dictionary, is to open the 3-part presentation, trying to describe in brief the main criteria we used to determine the content, structure and approach of the dictionary, and to say a bit about the book's coverage of women from the Scottish Islands, which I'm actually going to include the Western Isles as well as the Northern Isles. The first slide, you can see there is the cover, and this is the 2nd edition of the dictionary, which was published in November 2018, and it's an updated and expanded version of the 1st edition, which was published 12 years earlier in 2006. And going back to the beginning, in about 2000, the idea for a biographical dictionary of Scottish women was first raised by members of Women's History Scotland, which was a group comprising mainly academic historians, most of them women, and the majority of whom were teaching or researching in Scottish universities. And as it happened, at the same time, Edinburgh University Press was keen to find editors for such a project. So the four of us from Women's History Scotland volunteered to take it forward, and that was Sian Reynolds, myself, Elizabeth Ewan and Sue Innes, who tragically died before the 1st edition was published. The 3 of us continued as editors of the 2nd edition, and we were joined by Jane Rendall, who was an associate editor for the 1st edition. And both Jane and Sian will be speaking after me. Elizabeth lives in and is based in Canada, so she's unable to join us, unfortunately. Well, she could actually, but it's 5 o'clock in the morning, I think. At that time, in 2000, there was a dearth of published material about the lives of Scottish women throughout history, and in particular about the lives of named individual women. And it was to address this absence that we invited historians and others with specialist knowledge both to advise us on the choice of women to include in the dictionary and, if possible, to write entries for it. And in the end, for the 1st edition, we had contributions from just over 250 authors who together wrote more than 850 entries, with an average length of about 300 words each. For the 2nd edition, we invited more authors and added another 200 or so entries, many of them about women who died between the completion of the 1st and 2nd editions. So that was between 2004 and 17. The book is now available as an ebook and a paperback, and they're both selling from EUP at about £35, but you can get them for less on the internet. So it's really a very reasonable priced volume. So turning to our criteria, when we began to plan the dictionary, we first had to decide on a set of criteria for the choice of content and approach. And the first and most important of these was that we weren't going to include any living women. The second was that the subject, the woman, should have a strong claim to be Scottish, either through place of birth or death, or some other very close association with the country. And most of those we included were born and lived and worked in Scotland. Some chose to leave and work or settle elsewhere for all or most of their lives, often moving as far away as Australia, New Zealand, North America, as well as parts of the British Isles and Europe. We did stretch our definition of Scottishness in a few cases, for example, where the woman had no direct Scottish connection by birth, but had adopted Scotland as her home. And one example of this, if I can find it, is Margaret Gardner. Oops, she's not there. Yes. Yes, one example of someone who came to Scotland and remained there is Margaret Gardner. You see her here outside what's now the Pier Arts Centre in Stromness with a...
Sorry, Rose. Sorry,
Yeah.
I think you've stopped sharing your PowerPoint. Was that intentional?
Oh, no. Hang on.
No problem.
I can't seem to get out of it now.
Maybe if you close it and start it again, possibly.
Is that... Am I back to you again? No.
No.
How do I do that?
So do you remember the share button at the bottom of the screen? Maybe you...
Yeah, I'm not
Can you
seeing
see
that.
me? Yes.
Just so,
below...
yes, here we go. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Can you see Margaret Gardner now?
Not yet.
Okay.
Does it say that you've shared your screen? Oh
Yeah.
yeah, here it's coming. It's coming. It was just a bit of a delay.
Great, good. Well, that's her outside the Pier Arts Centre in Stromness, to which she donated her considerable art collection. And there were a lot of works by members of the famous St Ives group, which Sian is going to be talking more about her later. Another criterion for when we were planning the dictionary was that entries should represent all the regions of Scotland. And while it was inevitable there'd be a bias towards the more populous central belt and the main cities, we did our best to ensure a reasonable coverage from the Highlands and the islands. And in the second edition, we had a total of 52 from the Northern and Western Isles. There were 15 from Orkney, 1 from St Kilda, 13 from Shetland, and 23 from the Western Isles. And in contrast to most biographical dictionaries, we wanted our entries to represent a wide variety of lifestyles and occupations as possible, and to range in date from the earliest times to the present. And we were especially keen to include women whose lives were unexceptional in the traditional sense, but who'd made a significant contribution to the life of the country and its story. So the book includes entries on women whose lives were ones of physical toil, such as land labourers and factory workers, as well as queens, artists, educators, and a whole host of others representing a wide range of categories. And another of our key aims was that, unlike some other biographical dictionaries for which entries were written by a handful of authors with no particular knowledge of their subjects, we were keen that for ours, the contributors should, if possible, have researched the lives of the women they were to write about, or at least to have specialist knowledge of the background setting of the subjects' lives. And ideally, we hoped to find authors who'd actually known the women they were writing about. And we were actually very fortunate to find several people in that category from the Scottish Islands. So, for example, in the case of the second edition, the entries on Stella Sutherland, a Shetland poet, Goody Moberg, the photographer from Orkney, and the artist Sylvia Wishart, also from Orkney, were all written by women who actually knew those subjects personally. Yet another of our aims was to include some entries on women whose names are widely known, but are quasi-historical, mythical, or fictional. And one example is Jenny Geddes, who, according to oral tradition, flung a stool at the pulpit in St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh during a riot against the Scottish Prayer Book in 1637. And that's a depiction of the event on the screen, I hope, is it? Yes. Another example is Scota, the legendary eponymous ancestor of the Scots, who allegedly lived about 500 BC, making her, in fact, the earliest woman in the dictionary. And for the second edition, we even include a spoof entry, which you may or may not find. I think you have to start at the beginning and work right through the book to find it, which is quite an undertaking. So what kind of women did we actually include? A quick way to find out is to look at the thematic index at the end of the book, where the names of the women are grouped under broad category headings. And when we began to compile a list of categories, we realized that some women didn't fit easily under the most obvious ones, like politicians and writers. So we invented new ones, such as transgressors, criminals, victims, heroines, risk takers, and wise women, witchcraft. And as you see, in that case, they really could only apply to women. Inevitably, in the 10 years between the publication of the two editions, new research had revealed more unusual life stories, which led to the addition of new category headings in our index. And a notable example is slavery, which we divided into 3 subcategories: slaves, slave owners, and anti-slavery campaigners. An example of a slave is Malvina Wells, born into slavery in Grenada in around 1804, and later recorded as a lady's maid to Joanna McCrae in Edinburgh. And Malvina died in 1887, and the inscription on the gravestone tells us that upwards of 70 years she was, quote, a faithful servant and friend in the family of Mrs. McCrae, Edinburgh. So I'll turn now to women specifically from the Scottish Islands, and the ones we chose came from a wide range of backgrounds, some grand, but more often not. And of the examples that presented themselves as good candidates for inclusion in the book, many came under the broad category of arts and culture, reflecting both the long tradition of storytelling and song in the history of the islands, and also the strong influence of landscape and local resources on women's occupations. So poets, writers, singers, artists, knitters, photographers, folklorists, and so on are well represented. And it's these women's works that have played such a central role in conveying the essence of island life and culture over the centuries. And Sian will be saying a lot more about that later. Turning to Orkney, in the case of Orkney, the field of arts and culture are represented in the dictionary by several women, from, for example, the filmmaker Margaret Tate, journalist Bessie Skee, writers Anne Scott Moncrieff, Mary Brunton, and Florence Marion McNeill, the photographer Goody Moberg, and artist Sylvia Wishart, the last two appearing in the, hang on, here we are, Sylvia Wishart, the last two appearing in the second edition. Of course, not all the island women we included fell into these categories of arts and culture. Some became legendary because of their extraordinary experiences, such as Isabel Gunn from Tankernas in Orkney, who in the guise of a man joined the Hudson Bay Company in 1806 and amazed her colleagues by giving birth to a son. We also have an entry on a key historical figure, Margaret, Maid of Norway, Queen Designate of Scots, who died in Orkney, and others are Orkney women best known for their active citizenship, such as Laura Grimmond, a councillor and Liberal Party activist, and Marjorie Linklater, a campaigner for the arts, heritage and environment. And then there are some whose lives were in some way eccentric or unusual, such as Eliza Fraser, famous for being a castaway in Australia. and the healer, Alison Balfour, who was executed for conspiracy to murder by witchcraft. Turning to Shetland, while the lives of many of the women we included in the dictionary were well documented, some left very little trace, and one such example comes from Shetland. She's Reynolds Simonsdatter, who lived in the early part of the 13th century and was thought to be a tenant on a farm on Paterstour. We know about her because of a letter written in 1299 by the judicial representative of Shetland to Duke Hakon of Norway, who held Shetland as part of his possessions. The letter concerned a fiscal dispute involving the farm where Reynolds lived, and that's a good example of how some entries were based on really quite thin evidence. Others, one, for example, of a fishwife in Edinburgh was based, well, was prompted really by a photograph taken of her, which is why we came to know about her. This is the sort of thing that we found quite often. Of the other entries for Shetland, most of the women are known for their creative output, as in Orkney. So we have, for example, the filmmaker Jenny Gilbertson, you'll be hearing about later, poets Stella Sutherland and Rhoda Bulter, knitter and storyteller Mary Manson, and folklorist and writer Jessie Saxby. But we also have a howdy, or midwife, Elizabeth Balfour, and 3 women whose stories involve rescue and bravery at sea, May Moore, Grace Petrie, and Betty Mowat, shown here. Also a knitter, of course. Then there's Christina Jameson, remembered as one of Shetland's, quotes, most notable and talented women. And among her many achievements, she founded both the Shetland Folklore Society in 1930 and Shetland Women's Suffrage Society in 1909. And she was acutely aware of the plight of Shetland women, who she described as, quote, the real inhabitants of Shetland who alone maintain Shetland life. Quite a grand claim. And now turning to the Western Isles. As in the Northern Isles, women of the Western Isles also often became singers, poets, and writers, mostly in Gaelic, and we've included a number of them in the dictionary. The lives of these women had long been of interest to scholars of Gaelic and island literature, as well as to recorders of folk tales and songs, and some of whom we invited to advise us on which women to include, and of course also to write entries on them. And examples include the poet Mary Macpherson and the singer Kitty MacLeod. Not all the entries for the Western Isles are for Gaelic women, of course, but one is a very keen collector of folk songs and stories from the Western Isles, and she is Margaret Fay Shaw. And she was actually born in 1903 in America, and it was her interest in folklore and so on that led her from there to South Uist, where she stayed for several years before moving to the island of Canna, where she lived with her Scottish husband, John Lorne Campbell, for the rest of her life. We also have entries on 2 women whose endeavours brought acclaim, and in one case, economic prosperity to the Western Isles. The earliest of the 2 is Catherine Murray, Countess of Dunmore, who, following the death of her husband, became responsible for his estates, which included the Isle of Harris. Aware of the hardships suffered by tenants after the potato famine of 1846-7, and very impressed by the quality of the tweed being woven, Catherine Murray set about developing and promoting the island's tweed industry, using her considerable influence to bring it to the attention of the wider world. I don't think she's in that picture, but you can see this is a sort of promotion event for the tweed. Then there's Marion Hesketh, born in London in 1930, who together with her husband moved to Dervaig on the Isle of Mull and set up a theatre there, in which the 2 of them performed plays they specially adapted as double-handers, including Shakespeare plays and Chekhov plays. And their Mull Little Theatre, as it was called, became a key attraction to visitors to the island, and both were in fact awarded MBEs for their achievements. From the 21st century, for the second edition, we included Linda Norgrove, who spent her early years on the Isle of Lewis and whose work in overseas aid eventually led to her kidnap and tragic death in Afghanistan in 2010. Going back to much earlier times, we have an entry on two legendary warrior women from the Western Isles, Scathas of Skye and Aif of Alba, thought to have lived in around 500 BC. And from other isles in the West, we have a striking entry on two women closely associated with St Kilda. One is Wilhelmina Berkeley, a nurse born in Glasgow in 1883, who helped to evacuate the inhabitants of St Kilda in 1930. The other is Rachel Johnson, one of the evacuees who, together with her family, was taken to live in Lochallin in Argyll and was to be the last survivor of St Kilda's indigenous population. So to conclude, I hope this has been a very brief dip into the dictionary, but I hope it's given you an idea of the rich variety of women's lives explored in its 500 pages, and particularly women from the islands. One of our main aims was that, as well as providing essential facts about women's lives, the dictionary should also provide readable narratives of their life stories. And we could, of course, have included many more women, but for constraints of space and cost, of course. And perhaps in years to come, there might even be a digitized version, which, of course, would mean more subjects could be added at regular intervals. But for now, the printed version and the ebook has to suffice. And our hope has always been that it'll stand as a scholarly reference work to be used by researchers, teachers, and indeed anyone interested in women's contribution to the life of the nation, and it'll encourage a rethinking of what is meant by Scottish identity. And we also hope that the book will once and for all silence those writers of Scotland's history who claim that the absence of women in their published work is because very little is known about them. There are over 1,000 in the dictionary, so no more excuses in future. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Rose, for that fascinating presentation. You know, and there's so many fabulous women that you've included in this dictionary, and so it's obviously an absolutely crucial resource. And I was really pleased to hear about the price as well. That is not a very expensive book to buy, which makes it, you know, all the more accessible. So thank you, and we'll keep any questions for the end of the session. So people can keep posting them in the chat for us. And we will go on to the next presentation. So Rose, yes, I think you are stopping. You stop sharing your screen as well. Should be a button that says stop sharing. Maybe if you. Yes, thank you very much. Perfect. Okay, Andrew, can you pass the privileges to Jane?
I will indeed. There we go.
Right. Oh, that was quick. Fantastic. Do you want to go into slideshow mode as well, please? Yes. Thank you. Right. Okay. So the next speaker in this session on women from the Northern Isles is Dr. Jane Rendall, who is another of the editors of the Biographical dictionary that we've heard so much about already, and we're hoping to hear more as we go through this session. And so Jane is an honorary fellow in the Department of History in York, and she is published widely on the history of women and gender, focusing on Scotland, especially the 18th and 19th centuries. Today she's here to talk about women from Thule, two Shetland poets from the Napoleonic War, so Margaret Chalmers and Dorothea Primrose Campbell. So Jane, please go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex. In addition to the women Rose has discussed, We also have in our biographical dictionary 2 women poets from Shetland who were publishing during the Napoleonic Wars between 1803 and 1815. Margaret Chalmers, who was born in 1758, and the younger Dorothea Primrose Campbell, born in 1793. So their work, like that of many other previously neglected women poets across Scotland in this period, has recently attracted more attention. The biographical dictionary also includes Christian Grey of Perthshire, Christian Milne of Aberdeen, and Isabel Pagan of Ayrshire, who all came from humble backgrounds and published their poems in the same years. But Dorothea Campbell and Marguerite Chalmers were distinctive because they both explicitly identified with the far north. So the epigraph to Campbell's first volume of poems of 1811 identified her as a lone wanderer of the Northern Isles, placed far amid the melancholy main, in lines adapted from the Scottish poet James Thomson. Chalmers describes herself on the title page of her poems of 1813 as from Lerwick, Shetland, as did Campbell in her second edition of 1816. Often both she and Chalmers wrote of themselves as from Thule, the term used by classical authors to describe the far northern islands. As Constance Walker, who wrote our entry on Dorothea Campbell, discovered, in poetry she wrote for the London-based periodical, the Ladies' Monthly Museum. Campbell used the pseudonym Aura of Thule. Aura is the Latin word for coast or shore. Margaret Chalmers writes of herself as a Thulean maid. In the third verse in this poem, addressed to critics, she claims to be the first British Thulean quill since the Scandinavians ruled the islands. She doesn't here seem to know that Campbell's work was in fact published 2 years earlier. Remarkably, we don't even know whether the 2 women knew each other. I come to the work of Margaret Chalmers and Dorothea Campbell very much as an outsider and as co-editor of the Biographical Dictionary. I'm very indebted to all the scholars from Shetland and beyond who've written on them, especially Linda Rendall, Constance Walker and Penny Fielding. Today, I'll look briefly at first what these 2 women had in common with each other, and to some extent what they also had in common with other Scottish women poets from relatively humble backgrounds during the Napoleonic Wars. And I'll then say something about the differences between Campbell and Chalmers. There were clear similarities in their backgrounds, although Margaret Chalmers, who was 55 when her poems were published in 1813, was considerably older than Dorothea Campbell, who was only 18 in 1811 when her poems appeared. Both came from the professional middle classes, growing up in and around Lerwick, a growing town with a population of around 1,500 people in 1804. Chalmers' father was a customs officer who died leaving a widow and 3 daughters in financial difficulties. Her only brother, who was expected to support the family, died at Trafalgar in 1805. Campbell's father, an army surgeon, died in 1810, also leaving his family with many debts. Campbell, as the eldest daughter, started a school in Lerwick in 1813 to support the family. So for both Campbell and Chalmers, the publication of their poetry was driven by their poverty. Campbell's publisher, James Young of Inverness, wrote that though the poems were not written with a view to publication, quote, the distresses of a numerous family had led her to offer them to him to publish. Chalmers mentions circumstances of severe domestic affliction in her preface. Both poets were reliant on patronage. Dorothea Campbell dedicated her work to Jane, Duchess of Gordon, and her 2 editions relied on subscriptions and the support of friends. Margaret Chalmers' poems of 1813 had an impressive 465 subscribers, and she expressed grateful acknowledgements to the generous benefactors whose names have enabled her to accomplish her necessary undertaking. Both women approached Walter Scott for advice and support after he visited Shetland in 1814. Chalmers sent him a copy of her work, pointing out the errors introduced by the publisher, following this with a second letter. We don't know if he ever replied. Campbell met Scott on his visit and later wrote him to ask permission to dedicate her second edition to him. Then she appealed to him again for money in a series of long, sad, begging letters recounting her poverty. This need for patronage was a common pattern for poor women poets seeking to increase the family income. Christian Milne, publishing her simple poems on simple subjects in Aberdeen in 1805, like Campbell, dedicated the volume to Jane, Duchess of Gordon. Much of the poetry of Dorothea Campbell and Margaret Chalmers was in a sentimental, lyrical mode, both engaged with the life and landscape of Shetland. This could be in the form of a simple ballad, like Campbell's To Jenny of Yell. Jenny, if she met a pure heart, might dwell with him forever, quote, on the sea-beat shore romantic, in thy native Isle of Yell. Or they might represent daily life with a degree of realism, as in Campbell's The Shetland Fisherman, in which the fisherman, returning from a stormy night in his 6-oared boat, celebrated his success. Quote, today I mean to dine in state, on haddock, turbot, ling and cod. Fisherman, the life of the sea, and the hazards of storms and shipwrecks about which we've already heard, are very present in both women's poems. This is a sketch of fishermen's costumes from 1822, and I will return to the woman knitting later. Chalmers also has a very strong sense of place. So in her lengthy poem, Description of Sound near Lerwick, that's the area, I think, a mile to the southwest of Lerwick, she asks whether, as a partial native, she should fear to sing her natal scenes, and concludes, come muse, we'll do the task. Though lamenting the absence of softening woods, she writes of Lerwija's suburbs and her fortress, the cornfields in rigs or strips of land, a ruined popish chapel, a tinkling rill, and the profusion of nature everywhere. In another outstanding poem, The Rose of the Rock, she describes the view from the top of Noss Head, here called Handcliffe. It extended to the high points of Unst and to Rona's Hill to the north, and to the south to Fitful Head, Fair Isle and Orkney, with Thule to the west. Beyond her view lay Norway, the Faroes and Iceland. But amidst all this sublimity, there was a rose growing halfway down the cliffs, quote, full blown, all glowing, dazzling to the eye, inaccessible, but much desired by a young woman companion of childish, rash, impetuous years. Chalmers wrote that, quote, not Eden's fair, amid the fragrant bowers, more ardently desired forbidden fruit. And perhaps there's a hint here, as the critic Penny Fielding has suggested, of suppressed female desire. Yet both Dorothy Campbell and Margaret Chalmers also wrote of some of the common themes of women's wartime poetry. These included expressions of patriotism, sometimes straightforward, but sometimes ambiguously expressed, leaning towards pacifism. Campbell's Address to the British Navy, published after victory in 1816, was a simple celebration of British triumphs and sovereign empire on the sea. Chalmers, too, expresses a straightforward British patriotism in, for example, the first 3 poems in her volume, which all celebrate George III's Jubilee in 1809, marking the beginning of his 50th year as king. Her congratulatory lines begin, Happy Britannia, favoured isle. So even here there's a question towards the end. To crown the annals of this joyful year, might white-robed peace, adorned in smiles appear, and o'er contending nations wave her wand. But women wrote also of the devastation of family life, in the loss of sons, husbands and brothers that war brought. In Shetland, they had good cause to lament the loss of life. The historian Arthur Edmonston, writing in 1809, suggested that over 3,000 Shetland men, mostly press-ganged, were in the Navy, from a population of 22,400 in 1802, proportionately more than from any other county. Dorothea Campbell, in particular, represents the bitterness and inconsolable grief of women left to lament the fallen in 2 poems, The Distracted Mother and The Soldier's Widow at the Grave of Her Only Child. Here you can see the last 4 verses of The Soldier's Widow. Lamenting the death of both her child and her husband, she asks in the third verse, "Why didst thou go, my only love, the bloody war to wage? Blessed had I been, hadst thou reposed beside our infant son, not buried in a field of strife where bloody deeds were done." There's a sense here of the catastrophic effects of war on family and nation, similar to that found in other women poets. Also, like other women poets, Campbell shows the possibility of women accompanying their husbands to war, as she does in "O'er the Seas and Far Away," in which the narrator bids farewell to her native hills and dales, to, quote, "follow Henry far away, with him around the world I'll go. Together with her faithful tar," she says, "she will keep the watch at night and brave the shocks of war." There was the narrative too of the soldier's return. In Campbell's poem Ethelinda, the speaker laments the detested war which had killed her young lover Arthur, only to see before her, quote, "a poor aged son of war, wrapped in his tattered Highland plaid and seamed with many a ghastly scar, who turned out to be, of course, the once handsome youth, Arthur." Margaret Chalmers writes less about such suffering, except in two poems addressed to Lord Collingwood, her brother's commander in the Navy. One, to the memory of Lord Collingwood, recalled her own loss in her brother's death at Trafalgar. His blind, his aged mother's pride and prop, his sorrowing, helpless sister's only hope, Collingwood had backed unsuccessfully the family's petition to government for financial support after his death. I turn now to the differences between the two poets. While both wrote from a profound sense of identification with the far north, that took rather different forms. Though Dorothea Campbell did write of the social realities of Shetland life, she also participates in the romantic impetus to discover traditional cultures, as she explores Shetland folklore and legends. Later, in her only novel, Harley Raddington, published in 1821, she was to take up the themes of the national tale, popularised by Maria Edgeworth and Walter Scott. The reader of her poems in 1811 is introduced to Shetland beliefs in fairies, water sprites, and in the next poem, bokies. In 1811, she included a lengthy poem, The Spirits of the Hill. In 1816, she moved this poem to the beginning of the volume and added a short explanatory note. The inhabitants of Shetland suppose their hills to be haunted by certain fantastical beings whom they denominate bokies, and fairy folk or fairies, the former of whom are imagined to be spirits of evil and the latter spirits of good. So the first lines in this volume that the reader meets are these: "It was on Burray's sea-girt isle where fairies dwelt in days of yore." I'm assuming from the context to note that this is about the Shetland borough rather than the Orcadian Burray. Richard, whose two sons were killed at sea, was cared for by his beautiful daughter Bella. But Bella was stolen away and imprisoned by the king of the bad spirits, the evil Bokian monarch, who threatens to attack and destroy Richard's home. He is saved by, quote, "virtue's ready guardians, the green-robed fairies of the hill, the good fairies who fight a pitched battle to defend Richard and release Bella to a happier future." In another poem, Sarah and the Water Sprite, the beautiful Sarah, the loveliest maid that e'er o'er Bresay's mountains strayed, laments her lover, William, away at sea. She is visited by a brighter form than mortal, with streaming golden hair, accompanied by a black steed, who tempts her with some far kinder clime, with golden sands, orange groves, and myrtle bowers. But as she yields, mounts the horse and rides above the sea, the strange being, in fact a water sprite, turns into a dark fiend who disappears beneath the waves, leaving her to die. Margaret Chalmers does show some interest in traditional culture. In 1822, Samuel Hibbert suggested that the words to the Thule reel, the Charles of Thule, first appeared in her 1813 volume of poems. She writes that she included it for those of her readers who, quote, "love to trace the simplicity of rural insular life, even in its rude, unpolished state." But she was much more interested in the role of Shetland in a global commercial economy, in the place of women's labour in the economy, and in the social and domestic bonds of civil society. In her long and interesting poem, John's Mass, she calls for poetry to address the commercial world. John's Mass is named for the public market held when the Dutch herring fleet made its regular visit to Shetland at midsummer, around St. John the Baptist Day, 24th of June. You may recall the woman knitting in an earlier slide. The fair of John's Mass enabled Shetland hosiery, the produce of women's labour, to be sold to the Dutch and other visiting nationals, while a general holiday was celebrated. Chalmers explains this to the reader, while she describes such a holiday and all the festivities taking place while women sold their work. But war, with its dread trumpet, both in the past and during the Napoleonic Wars, brought a temporary end to such trade. Chalmers is also concerned with domestic life and with civil society. And by domestic, I don't mean private. A word that she uses very frequently is social. In her Lines on the Drawing Room of an Intimate Friend of the author's, Chalmers, through a description of tea time, briefly comments on British trade and competition with China, where British cups with China's porcelain vie. She celebrates how the social genius may pass the winter with newspapers, tobacco and conversation, as women weave or knit, with occasional games of cards and dancing. Both Margaret Chalmers and Dorothea Campbell, though impoverished, were part of the Lerwick middle class, and Chalmers closes her volume with two poems relevant to the growing associational life of that class, addressed to two relatively recent Lerwick societies: the Patriotic Society of Shetland, founded in 1808 to encourage improvement and philanthropy, and the United Trade Society, a friendly society, first founded in 1974 for all tradesmen, and later apparently open to all men. In the longer poem addressed to the latter, she celebrated a social institution that provided a form of insurance for families suffering from a breadwinner's illness and helped widows. And she also described in detail the Society's annual procession in Lerwick every 12th of January, in which all trades and professions, including doctors, lawyers and merchants, united. Finally, sadly, I don't have time to say anything about the later years of Dorothea Campbell or about her novel. I conclude with a reflection that's relevant to Dorothea Campbell and Margaret Chalmers, and also other women poets in our dictionary. The women poets of this period did not confine themselves to writing sentimental lyrics about private lives or to purely domestic horizons. They engaged with their communities and the concerns of those communities, in their working lives, in civil society, or even with reference to national institutions. In wartime, they might write of the loss of employment and of bereavement and death. Like many other women in the Biographical Dictionary, Campbell and Chalmers deserve to be better known. In their case, both for their poetry and for the light they shed on Shetland during the Napoleonic Wars. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jane, for that fabulous talk. So good to hear about these women poets, and especially poets who are not so well known, perhaps, and as you say, you know, really deserve more attention. So thank you for bringing them to life for us. And you've stopped sharing your screen. Thank you. So I know we've got some questions coming in, but we'll keep them for later. And we will now say thank you to Jane and pass on the role of the presenter to our next speaker, Professor Sean Reynolds. Andrew, can you pass the presenter privileges, please?
That's it done.
Oh, thank you. And here we've got the presentation coming up.
Slideshow.
Good.
Where's
Slideshow mode.
Oh, where's the slideshow? Oh, here we are.
It's always fiddly when you do it on the screen.
Hmm. Okay. Well, I'm pressing slideshow.
I think it's coming. Yes, play from start.
Yep.
Do you want to press the
it's just not making it central, but is it visible? If it's visible, I'll just go ahead, Sean.
Okay, that's
if you press the play from start button on the left-hand corner at the top there, it should run.
Oh, play from start. Okay.
that should be fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
That's fine. Thank you. That's good. It's just much bigger now, so we can see your slides more clearly. So thank you. So we've got Professor Reynolds here, who was a professor of French at the University of Stirling, and who has also worked extensively on women and gender, and published a lot on the cultural history of Scotland and France, and who's also one of the editors of the new Biographical Dictionary of Scottish Women. And she is here to talk to us about women and the visual arts in Scotland, focusing on the Northern Isles. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for organising this. Rose has given you an overview of the dictionary, and Jane has zeroed in on two particular women and sort of taken you out from the entries, which are short, into a sort of deep consideration of the lives. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a category and to look at, if you like, the architecture of what faces you when you do a reference book, because we need to insert women into the grand narrative, really, of Scottish history, and you find yourself up against various problems of definition. So I've chosen the one of the visual arts because it's a rather broad category, and it's a sort of catch-all expression. What do we mean by it? I mean, it covers the so-called fine arts, which are usually and conventionally painting and sculpture, applied arts of all kinds, like, for instance, stained glass, ceramics, camera arts like photography, cinema and video, conceptual art, and of course traditional or local arts and crafts. And all those definitions have implications for gender, and for where and when people are born and brought up. I mean, intersectionality applies here like it does almost everywhere. Who had the capacity and or the opportunity or the heritage in some cases, and I think that's important in this context, and the resources to practice any kind of visual art. And of course, it's changing very much at present. In the 21st century, the visual arts are changing very much. Since our dictionary only contains entries for women who are no longer alive, it doesn't reflect the much greater visibility, I think, of women artists, which is sort of going on almost daily as we speak in present-day Scotland as everywhere else. But in terms of presenting the past, we are where we are. And what I'm going to look at briefly are the kind of structural features of how you choose to make a selection in a field like this. If you look at the dictionary's index, which Rose already referred to, you can see that we have several index categories. Art and crafts, which includes, there are a lot of painters in that category. There are about 80 names, and a lot of them are painters. Sculpture we took out, and there are 11 names. Photography 9, media and cinema 9 names, media, radio and TV 18 names, not mostly to do with visual arts. Gaelic culture does contain some visual art, but it's mostly song and poetry, and what we call traditional culture, which has 45 names, but a great many of them are more to do with music. And so that was kind of tricky to make up index categories and to see how many of each category we could include. How did we arrive at the choice? I've got 4 books, among others, on my art shelves, and the first 3 were published just as we were starting to do the dictionary, and the 4th actually used the dictionary. So this is the first one, and it's a guide to the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art, which was published in 1999. And it's a great book, it's really useful. But the index to this contains about 170 names, 17 of them women, that is 10%. 2 names, Joan Eardley and Anne Redpath, who are in the dictionary, are well known in Scotland, if not so much elsewhere, a question I'll return to. But the general picture is that women are in a very small minority of acquisitions by the Scottish National Gallery. in up to the late 20th century, which was, I guess it's par for the course. And the second book I quote on is A Companion Guide to Photography in the National Gallery, 2001. And in this one, there's a slightly better ratio, 21 women out of 150 names. 2 of these are in the dictionary, Gunny Moberg and Maud Salter, but it includes several living Scottish women photographers now, Jane Brettle, Ruth Sterling, Katrina Grant. I think photography being a relatively new field reflects, and you will see this later, the greater presence of women in Scotland and worldwide, in fact. The next 2 books are devoted to Scottish women artists. This is one you may know, Jude Burkhouse's very path-breaking book on Glasgow girls, published back in 1990, of course, as a kind of rejoinder to the growing fame, actually, in the 80s and 90s of the Glasgow Boys School of Art. And these were women from the Glasgow School of Art in the 1880s to 1920s who specialised very much, although there were many painters, they specialised very much in the applied arts and crafts, of which women have long been seen as practitioners, whether that's ceramics, glass, embroidery, knitted, quilted objects, decoration, watercolours, book illustration, and so on, with plenty of examples. And then the 4th book is one you may know because it's much more recent. This is Modern Scottish Women Painters and Sculptors, again, covering a similar sort of period, but going up to 1965. And it's a narrower definition, painters and sculptors, that's fine art. And most of these women had trained, and predominantly in Glasgow or Edinburgh. And we know from the curators that they used the dictionary in the early stages to kind of get a fix on the number of women artists. So these 2 books, the last 2 books, tell us several things. Firstly, that since the 1970s, feminist historians have been trying to enlarge the canon of recognized named artists. You may know there's a famous 1971 article by Linda Nochlin called "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" But most of the names they have found have been of easel painters and sculptors. That is what's sometimes called the higher echelons of recognized art. And that explains why the dictionary, which is produced at a particular historical moment, we have a lot of entries on the fine arts, which reflects the specialist we could call on. And most art historians are working in that field. And the second point is that one answer to what Linda Nochlin was asking is that the fine arts do depend on formal training in large measure, from which women were quite specifically excluded up until the late 19th century when they were admitted to art colleges. And they started to take it up in much greater numbers, of course, in the 20th. And in Scotland, that, of course, means going to an art school means probably going to one of the 4 big cities, which have been extremely important in nurturing young artists. So it depends where you start from, and if you can travel, and if your family can afford to send you to art school. And if you live in, for instance, the Highlands and Islands, it is or was not so easy. So many of our examples in the dictionary are therefore from the last 150 years or so, and from central Scotland, or at least have a central Scotland part to them. And then thirdly, these books tell us that feminist historians like Jude Burkhouse have also worked to enlarge the definition to applied arts and design, decorative arts, which of course are still, and were then and are also studied in art college. And Elizabeth Cummings has written about arts and crafts. There are plenty of women in these areas, but there are far less likely to be renowned names on whom research has been done. So although we have made an effort, we don't have so many women in the applied arts and crafts. Some areas of the arts, and especially connected with the camera, have been easier to break into than others. And women made their mark in both photography and filmmaking in the 20th century. There are, if you like, there are fewer gatekeepers or formal training requirements early on in photography and cinema. And there are plenty of famous women photographers, and there are today more women film directors, more and more. our category of media film contains art directors as well as actors. That isn't to say it's easy for women in these professions necessarily, but it was harder to keep them out in the early part of the 20th century. So, and there you will see, I will mention later, more than one women from the Highlands and Islands in that category. And finally, what about traditional art, which partly overlaps with, but isn't identical with the applied arts. And this is where the question of geography comes in again. On the whole, traditional art forms tend to be associated with local areas. And in Scotland, that can be rural or island contexts far from the big cities. But they do, of course, have a very strong claim to be recognised not only as a craft or, as Jane was suggesting at the end of her talk, commercially important, as knitted goods were for Shetland. They have a strong claim to be recognised as visual arts. And of course, the Northern Isles have their particular forms. And we did want to have some named women from all over Scotland, so that we had some representatives of traditional arts. This is a picture of a shawl by Amy Johnston from Shetland in 1935. So that's all sort of goes towards sort of a structure of where we are with trying to find the right way to represent women in art history, if you know. So we did include one traditional hand knitter who's already been mentioned. Lynn Abrams contributed the article on the entry on Mary Manson of Yell. I don't have a picture of one of her shawls, so I've showed you the one by Amy Johnston, who we don't know very much about, or at least I couldn't find very much about. Perhaps somebody else does. And there are many skilled knitters in the islands. This is just a simple advertisement. I think they have the right to be considered visual artists, but they are generally speaking anonymous. That designs for knitted goods are not really often described as being creative. Another spinner and knitter who we've already heard about is Betty Mowat. The only reason we know about Betty Mowat is, of course, because she had a very famous involuntary voyage adrift to Norway, which was romanticized in William McGonagall's poem, The Wreck of the Columbine. Apparently, they sent the price of her shawls up, but commercially that was not a bad thing for her. But I mention that simply because the point is that while traditional crafts are usually practiced by people born and brought up in the local area, and there will be a paper I was very glad to see coming up on this on Friday, when it comes to other kinds of art, such as painting, filmmaking, and so on. For Shetland and Orkney, for the Northern Isles, travel becomes part of the equation, that people are either incomers or outgoers, often shuttling between home and abroad, and between island and mainland. I'm putting up this list, and I'll put it up again at the end just so that you can catch a few of the names, one or two of which have been already mentioned. I'll start with a couple of outgoers. Margaret Tate, who's the fourth on the list there, was a documentary filmmaker born in Stromness, but she spent much of her life away from home. She has received more recognition in recent years. She read medicine originally and served in the RAMC, but she trained in filmmaking far from home in Rome. And she found it extremely hard to get funding for most of her documentary films. But she did later in life return to make a poetic feature film, which was partly filmed in Orkney. It's called Blue Black Permanent, and it stars Gerda Stevenson. Another outgoer is the third name on the list, Sylvia Wishart, whom Rose has already mentioned. And she was also born in Stromness, encouraged by a teacher in Stromness Academy, and she studied in Gray's School of Art in Aberdeen, where she later lectured. And after returning to Stromness, she was closely associated with the Pier Arts Centre, which I'll mention again in a moment. This is a picture which Sylvia Wishart did when she was a student at Gray's. And thank you to George Shane of the Robert Gordon University Collections for the image. And when I asked him for the image, he actually remembered Sylvia Wishart as a teacher. And our contributor, Carol Dunbar, also knew her personally. But she went out of Orkney to train. So those are two outgoers, and much more common is the case of several women who are incomers to the Northern and Western Isles, and stayed, often having fallen in love with them. I'm jumping a bit, but a painter, Bette Lowe, unfortunately, I don't have any of her pictures because I couldn't get permission. She's in the second edition of the dictionary because she died in 2007. She didn't live in Orkney, but she came very often to Orkney, and is the only one in the Scottish Women exhibition of 2015 who did have Orkney connections. She trained in Glasgow and she did oils and watercolours, landscapes with a rather abstract tinge to them. So she was an incomer, as was Gunny Moberg, who you have a picture of here, originally from Sweden. And having to come to Scotland as a teenager, she moved to Stromness, where she took up photography, and she was closely associated with the other St Magnus Festival in Orkney, taking photographs of the artists who came there, and closely associated too with George Mackay Brown. She took many photographs of him, as indeed was Sylvia Wishart, and with the Arts Centre. And our entry was written by Rebecca Marr, who knew Gunny Moberg personally. So in parallel to Margaret Tate, who had to work outside Shetland and indeed often outside Scotland, there were several incoming documentary filmmakers who made films about Shetland, especially Jenny Gilbertson and Elizabeth Balneves, with whom she cooperated, both being drawn to island life, having grown up elsewhere and travelled very widely. But as you will be hearing about them in some detail immediately after this session, I won't say any more about them here, but they are examples of women who are incomers to the islands. And I'll end with an example of someone who is very much an incomer that Rose mentioned. All my previous examples were Scottish women by birth. Margaret Gardner is the same photograph outside the Pier Arts Centre in Stromness. Wasn't an artist at all herself, but we have several examples of women who are, one should call them perhaps enablers. She was a collector, an important figure in helping artists to exhibit. She was the moving spirit behind the Pier Arts Centre, actually, in which both those other women I mentioned had much to do. She was English, but happened to be born in Berlin, a very unconventional and well-connected woman in the 1930s. She especially knew the group of artists around Barbara Hepworth and Ben Nicholson, who later settled in St Ives. And she bought their early works. And in the 1950s, bought a cottage in Rousey in Orkney. And she later donated her collection, which of course was quite useful, of these painters and artists who'd become famous in the meantime. She donated her St Ives collection. So it holds, the Pier Arts Centre has important works by Hepworth, Nicholson, Alfred Wallace, and it now includes Scottish artists like Margaret Mellis, Paul Otzi, Alan Davey, Bette Lowe, whom I mentioned, and Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham, for example, another artist who's Scottish artist in the dictionary. So in conclusion, I'll just put the list up again so that you can just check some of the names. I just conclude by saying, when you're coming to do a reference book like this, it's tricky. There are kind of rings of fame. The names of certain Scottish artists, or indeed writers or historical figures, are recognised all over the world, at any rate in Europe and North America. And others have fame or renown within the British Isles. Others, again, are very well known in Scotland, but not south of the border. And I think some rather key examples are painters like Joan Erdley and Anne Redpath, who are extremely well known in Scotland, known to some extent in the British Isles, but not as much as you would expect. And finally, local artists with essentially local reputations who deserve to be much better known, like the poets that Jane was mentioning, like Sylvia Wishart. And I was very impressed by the paintings that John Goodlad mentioned in his fascinating lecture as well, by a painter unknown to me. so that when you're doing a reference book, you're sort of negotiating between the well-known and the not so known, and what are the criteria. And I'll end on the paradoxical fact that, in fact, the traditional arts and crafts of the Northern Isles are collectively very famous globally, worldwide. I mean, Shetland lace shawls, Faroe sweaters, without their creators being named as a rule. Whereas individual artists from Scotland, and especially perhaps from the islands, who meet the requirements that might otherwise have made them well known elsewhere, sometimes struggled because of what is known in Australia as the tyranny of distance, from their names being better known. But I hope in future reference books, this will be far less the case. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Sharon, for that fantastic lecture. So just taking us now into the world of the visual arts, and so many women that you've told us about, both sort of born in Scotland and those who have moved to Scotland and made Scotland their home. Just fascinating. And I have to say, especially, you know, like talking about film, but also bringing in sort of arts and crafts. And for example, I love the photograph of the shawl, the beautiful shawl by Amy Johnston. Absolutely beautiful. And I think it's easy maybe sometimes to forget these things as well, as part of the visual arts. So thank you for that. And we have a number of questions that have been put in the chat, and most questions actually seem to be relevant for all of you, as you've all contributed to and editors of the biographical dictionary. So I will read some of them, and we have a bit of time, so we can start looking at the questions here. So the first one is, how would rates of literacy have differed between men and women in the early 19th century? Were these poets exceptional? So this is a question about poets.
Yeah, I think, yes, you can hear me. Yes?
I hear you clearly.
Yes, yes, certainly there were differences, significant differences between the literacy rates of men and women in the early 19th century. Nevertheless, well, I think I should say that the women that I was talking about were from middle-class backgrounds, so they were literate. We don't know very much about their education, at least about Chalmers' education. Campbell was sent to a boarding school in Inverness as a young woman, and became a kind of governess. Apparently she was a kind of governess when she published her poems. I think they would have acquired quite a lot, perhaps through the teaching of their brothers. They would have started to understand quite a literary world. More generally, I think it is sometimes startling to discover that there were women poets from quite humble backgrounds, who worked as domestic servants, who were perhaps encouraged to acquire literacy in service, who would probably have attended parish schools, perhaps not at a very high level. But what is a little startling when one starts to read the poetry of such women is that they have acquired, they did read 18th century poetry, lyrical poetry, sentimental poetry, and that they were familiar with the styles, pastoral style, the lyrical style that were adopted. Margaret Chalmers in particular has quite a wide range of classical references. So it's a wide-ranging question, and one shouldn't make too many assumptions, is what I think I'm saying. One should be open to the possibilities of what women might achieve.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting point you make there. Sometimes you hear lots of assumptions that women couldn't do a number of things. They couldn't read, they couldn't write, whatever time period you're talking about. So I like your answer very much there. I think we have a number of questions actually relating to your dictionary as a whole, and how you made the decisions. And also I think lots of people are very delighted to hear about this and would like maybe this dictionary to be better known. So somebody said, would you think about putting entries from the dictionary on Wikipedia? I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, if you look up some of the names on Wikipedia, you will very often find that they quote the dictionary in the notes.
So you're featuring there already.
But sometimes it is a source.
Yeah, I'm guessing as the dictionary is very reasonably priced as well, then maybe that need is slightly smaller. And I heard there was an ebook as well, which of course in these times is something that might be proved very popular. So we have other questions as well. What was rationale for including legendary characters in the dictionary?
That's one for
I don't think there's an easy answer to that, is there? I mean, we felt that legendary characters, and incidentally, one of them is Ma Brune, were women whose names were part of the sort of the story of Scotland, and were terribly well known. And some people might even have thought they were not legendary. You know, people like Kate Barlas and Jenny Geddes and others were just names that are widely known in the story, and I think that was justification enough really for including them. Would that be fair, Sian and Jane? I think
that's quite fair. I think, you know, that people may have had the impression that Jenny Geddes was a historical figure, and that it's quite important just to review that and suggest how the name came to have acquired its prominence, and how little we actually know about her. I should say that all the entries do have a bibliography so that people can read on as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Another question here, were there any difficulties in collating information for particular categories, for instance, engineering, information technology, and the gaming industry? That takes it to danger fields.
We were very lucky on engineering. We had a specialist on engineering, Nina Baker, in Glasgow, and she helped us a lot about tracking down engineers. But if you look at the time scale with which we were operating, of course, there are relatively few qualified women engineers who had lived and died in the time scale. There are now many more women engineers, but they're still, thankfully, still alive. But I think that's part of the structure, that some professions have only become recently available to a lot of women. So therefore, you're going to, that's my phone, you're going to find a lot of women being able to do something, but you need quite a large mass before certain names come up and become well known. And reference books are, of course, built on that kind of structure. But yes, we do have some very important women engineers in there. Just look in the index and you'll find their names. Can't remember the other categories you said, but maybe Jane or Rose can.
So it's information technology in the gaming industry, which is a recent addition.
Sorry,
yes.
I'll call you back whoever you are.
That's another one that's too recent, really, for us to have found women who were prominent in those industries, I think is fair to say.
Yeah.
Yes, and we had an interesting question as well here from Julie. Do you have a favourite entry, I guess, or maybe one who shocked or surprised you the most while researching them? Is there a particular woman? I mean, this would go to any of you that's kind of stood out and that surprised you.
Oh, it's always difficult, this, because, you know, they're all remarkable. I think some of them, from my point of view, I have sort of a personal interest in our one bell ringer who's in the book, who was added in the second edition. And she was the first woman bell ringer in Scotland and died very young, unfortunately, and moved to England. But as a bell ringer myself, I have a soft spot for her. I think my admiration, and this is partly because I've done a lot of research on her, is for my main admiration, if you like, or an example of a woman I particularly admire, is Crystal Macmillan, who, partly thanks to the dictionary, actually, is now her name is now on one of the buildings in Edinburgh University, the Crystal Macmillan building. And when they were searching for a name for a new building, we were asked if we could recommend anyone, and indeed her name was incredibly obvious as a choice, because she was born in Edinburgh and she was a remarkable woman who became a barrister, but she was one of those women who undertook so many tasks outside her profession. As well as being a barrister, she was also very much involved in many major organizations, particularly suffrage organizations. And she was also one of the founders of the famous International Peace Conference in The Hague in 1914, I think it was, or 1912.
15.
Thank you. So she's one of my heroes, and as I say, Marjorie Sampson, the bell ringer, is another.
Yeah, well, I could engineer if for those who are keen on engineering, and it was indeed provided by Nina. It's Dorothy Pullinger, who is a motor engineer, and indeed she designed a car specifically for women. It was called the Galloway. And the first model was in suffragette colours. Because I still think there is never anywhere to put a handbag in a car. And I think she provided a place for a handbag in this car. But anyway, she was, in fact, a serious motor engineer. And so she's one of my favourites.
I'll just mention a name that I think people won't have come across, Eglantine Wallace. Who lived in the late 18th, early 19th century, born into the Scottish aristocracy, but abandoned the standards of her class. She became a novelist, a dramatist, a spy, a traveller, and a cross-dresser. And she was notorious, held up to ridicule, but maintained her course regardless. So if you want to know more about her, you can find her in the dictionary.
Well, thank you so much for those questions. Such inspiring answers there. I'd love to hear more at one point about the car and the suffragette colours. I think that just sounds fantastic. We have a final question, which I think would be quite a nice way to finish the session, and that is also from Julie. And she said, how can a new entry be suggested? It's been good to understand the criteria you've outlined already, but are you welcoming suggestions for the future?
I think it's fair to say that we don't really think we've got a future as a team of editors if there's another interval of 10 years before now and the next one. But it's very difficult. I mean, that we were thinking that this time with the second edition, it might have been a digital product. But the fact is that we simply wouldn't have had the resources, financial or personal, to undertake something that requires constant updating and constant research. Unlike, say, the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, where they have a team of staff constantly working. So I'm afraid the answer is we're not taking any suggestions for new entries. We don't even know if there'll be a third edition, which is sad to say, but that's the situation.
We do have a very large back burner list, as we call it, of names we would have liked to put in, and we've passed on some of the papers and index cards and so on to somebody else. So somewhere someone may take it forward, but as Rose said, until it's digitized, then we can't take any further new entries. But there are criteria, and if you wanted to get in touch with us, we could sort of explain that, but not time to go into it now.
Well, thank you. I think that puts an end to a wonderful, wonderful session, and I really would like to say thank you to our three speakers, and also add that there are a number of just comments in the chat as well about saying what a wonderful session this has been, and I think it's inspired us all to think more about women in the islands. So thank you for speaking to us today, and we're now breaking for a quick coffee. We'd love to invite for a coffee, but you'll have to get your own today, I'm afraid. We'll be back in about 10 minutes time at 11:30. Thank you everybody yet again.